Hello, folks. I'm John Myhre, and sitting here is a co-host of the Bassin podcast is Ken Milender. And Ken, and for people that don't know who I am out there, I've been a fishing guide up here for 45 years. I've been doing an outdoor radio show for 35 years. Grew up hunting and fishing down in southern Minnesota with my grandpa. And I know you grew up in northern Minnesota doing a bunch of fishing.
Yeah, in Warwood, Minnesota, 6 miles from Canada on the western side of Lake of the Woods.
How long did it take you to get from saying, hey, after you're done talking?
Yeah, I'm from Canada, eh?
Yeah, well.
Them Canadians, they can drink our beer like it's Kool-Aid dust. I mean, they can really drink the beer, that's for sure.
Well, I know that, and talking about fishing up there, you got a good bass fishing up there, too. And people think about Lake of the Woods and up in northern Minnesota, especially for walleyes, but you've got some tremendous smallmouth bass fishing up there, and you spend a lot of time doing that.
Yeah, if you get up anywhere near Young's Bay, you got Oak Island, Little Oak Island, and I think it's Flag Island.
Flag Island, yep.
Yep, and then you can go all the way up to Monument Bay, and there's for that smallmouth fishing is like they've never seen a lure in their life.
When did you get into doing tournament fishing for bass?
1989.
89's a while.
Yeah, my second cousin Wayne Lindgren, he got me involved into bass fishing, and I bought myself a little 14-foot Lumacraft John boat with a Tohatsu motor that I always told the other anglers was too hot for you. I'm going to catch the fish out of this little thing.
Well, fishing has changed a lot, I mean, we saw the rise of bass fishing started, I believe, in the 60s and 70s when it really started to get hot. But that coincided with some of these southern reservoirs becoming really hot. And that's where the whole BASS and all that stuff are coming from down south. But up here, 45 years ago when I came here, there was not a whole lot of bass stuff available out there. It was just mostly walleye, muskie, northern pike. But now we're seeing more and more. We're seeing tournaments up here all the time now.
Yeah, they're actually traveling from a few hours away to come up here for our excellent fishing. So, as an example, right now I'm a member of the Flambeau Bassmasters, a part of Bassmasters.com. And this year is the 50th anniversary of the Bass Club. One of the first ones that created a bass club on behalf of Bassmasters, and there's like 36 members right now. So there have been a handful of guys that really know how good bass fishing can be up around this area.
Well, yeah, and people think about down south, and we've said this on the other podcast too, but I'm going to say it again, but, you got a better chance. If you go to Lake Fork in Texas, for instance, or Pickwick, or one of them big lakes down south, you got a better chance of catching 8 or 10 pound bass than you do here. But what comes in actually in most tournaments, not the pro level tournaments, but the club tournaments and stuff, is pretty commensurate with what we see come in up here during tournaments, right?
Yeah, well, what I found is that down south is your opportunities of catching a big fish, for the area, it's only like 3 or 4 weeks out of the year. With live scope, that's expanded a little bit more, but, around here, you can catch a 5-6 pound bass, almost every day you go out on the water during the summer. Yeah,
so pretty good quality fishing. And now, you said the word summer, and we talked about spring in the last episode, about early spring. And once we get basically toward the end of May and into June, you get into that post-spawn period, right?
Yeah, one of the things that, is probably one of the best tips I can give any angler is proper use of your electronics. So all fish relate to different bottom substrate or depth changes. So I learned, years ago, back when I used to take a 2-pound hammer, drill a hole through the handle and drag it behind the John boat. I'm looking for depth change and or rock and muck combos. Well, now with electronics, take your auto gain off, set your depth on your chart view to 3.5 times the depth of water that you're in, and then adjust your gains so you have a second echo. You'll have a echo, 2 or 3 inches below your screen for the initial ping from your transducer on the initial bottom, and then adjust your gains so you see a second one that shows some grainy material or pixels going across your screen, and then you can just barely see the other one. So when you're trolling on a weed line, once you hit rock, you're going to see a third line of transmission from your transducer. And then you can always pay attention to depth change. So, for instance, if bass relate to a lot of weed flats, so when you got 2 miles of weed flats by a half mile wide, you'll spend 2 weeks trying to find out where the fish are. So you can, tilt your motor up and just idle across all that and watch that, and you'll find the hard bottom spots, the muck bottom spots. So, and then depth changes. So it only takes like a few inches of depth change or a little rise. Usually it's conducive to a harder bottom, so you're going to see that double stronger or triple echo. Triple echo, if you really experiment a little bit with your gain, every electronics is a little different. I just can't tell you go to 80% gain. You have to experiment. Go to a weed line where you're in, say, 10 feet, set your screen depth to 35, and then adjust your gain so you can see a strong echo on your second one, and just drive the edge. When you see rocks, it's going to show that triple echo.
You're referring mostly to the 2D or regular sonar screen.
Yeah, well, you can do it on a flasher too. I've done it on the ice back old school. I'd take my little chipper and chip a hole in the ice, pour some water in there, put my transducer in, and then set it. I know I'm on muck now, so I'll just barely get a second echo, and then I move around a little bit shallower, and then you can find rock ridges through the ice.
It doesn't matter whether you're a flasher or a liquid crystal screen or side imaging. It's all telling you the same information. And one odd thing I've added into that too is that, with down imaging and especially side imaging, I run the side imaging a lot looking for hard bottom areas because it really stands out on that, because you'll be going along and the whole bottom will actually brighten way up. It'll get a lot brighter as you come up on a little hump or a rise off the side of the boat. And if you got rocks in there, obviously you see the rocks too and the pebbles and stuff. So, get into using your sonar to find those areas, those hard bottom areas. And, and then the mapping too. With the mapping we've got now is so much better than other mapping. I remember one of the guides here in Hayward here, I don't think he guides anymore, but he was always telling me, I know this lake like the back of my hand. I don't need those maps. And he put a map cartridge in. After I finally talked him into getting a Humminbird, he put a map cartridge in. He said, oh, crap, I didn't know all that was there. He says, it's just so much you learn. I'll guarantee you that no matter how good you know a lake, if you get some of the new mapping, you're going to say, wow, I didn't know that, because there's stuff out there. And then you could go out now with this stuff and you could actually create your own maps just by driving back and forth and zigzagging across the lake and make a better map. So you use a combination of all of that stuff. You're trying to find that 10% of the water that's holding 90% of the fish. And that's exactly about what it is. There's 90% of the water is water you don't want to be fishing in.
Yeah, that's very true. So, Tim Duffy, old school guide, I don't know if he's still guiding around, but we were out on Grindstone one day, and I had found this one spot, and I told his brother Tom and him, we were pre-fishing for a tournament. Tom and I were coming up, and I go, you got to see this spot. And he goes, how do you find that spot? This has been a family secret for 25 years. How'd you find this spot? I go, it's on my map.
It's on the map. Yeah. It's pretty easy to see this stuff when it's on the map. I mean, and I've seen places where I knew there was a weed bar, a weed line there, but I didn't know exactly how it laid or whatever. And I'm looking at it, so wow, that's different than I knew before. And then sometimes, and quite often, actually, you look at it on the map and it's what you didn't expect it to be. But then if you go out and you remap it with any one of it, I don't care whether it's Lowrance or Humminbird or Garmin, all of them have a mapping feature now. And you go out and you remap that section, and it'll be even different. I mean, it's amazing the differences.
Yeah, they got updates every year, So if you have the old Humminbird or Garmin or Lowrance, every company offers updates, and I suggest, you do updates, every spring before you get on the lake. That way you have the latest technology for your graph.
Yeah, if you have a real complex piece of structure, too. If you got a bar that there's a lot of points and turns and stuff on it, even though you may have the latest and greatest in the mapping, I'd encourage people to go out and spend an hour or two going back and forth across that thing and map just that bar, because you're going to be amazed. You're going to find all the little turns and corners and points and stuff that maybe even the best map don't show you.
Yeah, there's some lakes here locally that don't have the 1-foot contours, so that leaves you to more boat travel to learn the lake. We mentioned before, sometimes there's somewhat of a controversy out there on forward-facing sonar, but,
guys say, well, it's unfair. Well, it is to almost to the point where it's unfair, and it has the potential to do damage if you have people that are meat hogs or, use it irresponsibly. But as far as finding and catching fish, I mean, you look at the one guy that's hot on the YouTube, that Boley. I mean, he started out doing his videos. He was using side imaging. He'd find a school of walleyes. He'd spot lock. He'd waypoint him. He'd spot lock him. He'd catch him. Then he went to 360, find the walleyes on 360, spot lock, and catch him. Now he's using forward-facing sonar. My point is he was doing the same thing with the side imaging as he's doing with the live sonar. The only difference is that, and it's a big difference, you can see how the fish react to your bait with live sonar, and you can actually see if they move or when they're moving, whereas with the regular side imaging or 360, it's history. You're looking at where they were, not where they are right now.
Well, with 360, you can kind of get an idea of which way they're traveling, but it's, a delay. It's a few second delay, when the swing of the transducer relays a message to your screen. But with live, you could just stay on them.
Let's talk a little bit about summer patterns and stuff. I mean, we've got shallow, deep, and everywhere in between. You got fish that'll be up in the slop and the junk weeds sometimes. You got fish that'll be out off that deeper weed edge. A lot of that is variable on the weather. A lot of it's variable on the lake. Each lake is different sometimes. Where do you start looking? You're fishing a tournament. Where do you start on a lake you haven't been on before?
Depends upon the water temp. That gives you a big idea. So, for instance, going back and reading your electronics, a lot of the bass are going to be on the flats majority of the summer. And then even in the fall, they'll make their migration from the deeper edges of the weeds to the shallows.
The smallmouth too? Or just the
smallmouth, that's a little different. An example of a lake where you can catch both smallmouth and largemouth in the same area would be Lac-Courte, Grindstone, and the Chippewa flowage here locally. You can sometimes on Shell Lake, but they're going to be smaller smallmouth with the larger largemouth. Docks, you can catch both species on majority of the lakes around here. But when you come to the deeper glacial type lakes, usually the smallmouth midsummer, they'll go out in the deeper water, and the largemouth, they just won't leave the weeds.
Yeah, there's a big difference between, say, like a Chippewa flowage or a reservoir flowage and a natural lake like Coudray or any of the big natural lakes, because there they tend to be deeper. It seems for some reason they tend to be, more shallow. I mean, when I had the resort years ago, I had some guys come in from Tennessee, and back then they were keeping these big bass flaying. They were keeping these 20-inch smallmouth and flaying them. And I'm like, why are you killing them? Well, we want to eat them. Well, how are you catching them? He said, we're fishing them like largemouth. Basically, they're fishing the shorelines. They're fishing up underneath docks and stumps and logs, just like you fish a largemouth. So there's a difference in pattern between the flowage reservoirs and the big clear natural lakes most of the time, isn't there?
Yes, there is. Largemouth, they prefer weeds, and on the flowage, the bigger smallmouth, they like that eelgrass. I think it's due to the predator-prey relationship. They just prefer the eelgrass for comfort when they're not out on the rocks or laying next to a tree feeding.
Let's go talk largemouth a little bit. Summer largemouth. You say they're going to be up on the flats most of the time, but what depth are you talking? Because I know I've caught fish largemouth in the summertime at 18, 20, 25 feet on the edge of a break on the drop-off, but it's always the weed edge.
Sometimes they'll go beyond the weeds, and it seems like early morning cabbage with water milfoil or raisin milfoil around it can be really, really good for largemouth. If you have a rock ridge that's near that, smallmouth will be there at the same time. And usually it's an early morning bite. Seems like when northerns and muskies, they like to feed, 10 to 11. Big northerns will come into the cabbage areas because they can sit underneath there without no interruption with weeds touching their body or anything, so they can position, without being touched by the weeds. That a lot of northerns don't like that. The bass just seem to leave, and majority of the time they go shallower. And they'll go into the milfoil or water milfoil and just set a little bit deeper, a little bit shallower. Sometimes they'll go to the inside weed line. Midsummer, I've seen smallmouth in 2-3 feet of water, just pure sand. But there has to be an edge of the sand, whether it be 6 inches to 2 feet is really good. Smallmouth will be on the sand, big ones too. And then marabou hair jigs are good for that. Small swim jigs and dragging a football jig are really good presentations for that when they go up on them sand flats. And Le Coudray, once they go on that, it can be there's a lot of them.
Yeah, well, you got the cover. When you're up on them shallows and the flats and the shoreline, you've got the cover. You've got wood up there. Wood is usually pretty good. You've got in the flats, you've got weed cover. Different kinds of weeds. I mean, one that we talk about up here is an exotic weed, the Eurasian water milfoil. It's a canopy weed, basically. The most of the growth of the leaves are way up high on it. It holds a lot of things that'll create food for the fish and stuff, for the bait fish, draw the bait fish in, but it also covers underneath it. Fish go underneath it, and it's like a big umbrella canopy over the top. So that's like a fish magnet. A little bit harder to fish sometimes because it's so dense, But
when the water temp gets, say, 68 to 75 up here, that really comes into play with a lot of fish using it, including the zooplankton, phytoplankton, which creates the whole food chain. Biggest thing I see about the benefits to that is the pH. So they can adjust to any depth or anywhere within that to get optimum pH, being 7.2. So a lot of fish will suspend underneath there. The minnows will be right underneath, so they have the cover of the canopy. And then, a lot of muskie anglers, they target that weed because the predators go in there to feed because it's such a strong ecosystem.
Well, when you're fishing at weed flats and stuff and you're looking fairly shallow from the shoreline out to, say, 8, 9, 10 feet, and you're fishing the weeds and looking for the largemouth, what does wind factor come in for you, or the type of day, whether it's overcast or sunny or whatever?
Depends upon the pH. A lot of anglers, they don't study the scientific data based upon the position of the fish. So, for instance, there have been mornings when I have gone out on a lake and all the sunfish are out from the weed line and dimpling at the surface. Huge schools that can be, a mile long that your boat scares. Well, then why were they there? So if you go on the last 3 days, high sun, zero wind, I believe that the pH was too high due to photosynthesis. So they just moved out just a little bit for a more optimum water conditions.
Well, oxygen and pH both change.
They go hand in hand.
Yeah, and they change. I mean, when you have sunlight, usually you got better oxygen coming off the plants. When you have no sunlight, you have less. So there's a bunch of factors there. But wind will kind of get things moving too and shake all that invertebrates and moving in the water, get the bait fish going too.
They mix it, and it mixes the layers of oxygen, because there'll be layers of oxygen within a weed flat, especially when you're in 10 foot of weeds and it's weeds for like a quarter mile to shore. If you can find them hard bottom spots within that weed flat, which we discussed about finding it with your electronics, going up on top of the flats, you can find the hard bottom spots. Usually cabbage is conducive to hard water or hard bottom substrate growth. Coontail is more of decaying matter weed growth. It's a non-rooted plant that usually grows on the dying weeds from turnover from years past, where it creates siltation on the edge of a steeper break. And you can even find that in the shallows too. So all it takes is an edge to collect the sediment. And then there's water milfoil, which is really dense. They'll use that as a wall to position themselves to attack, crawdads and stuff.
Well, there's a whole lot of factors to look at there when it comes to largemouth. If you're up on them flats or shallows, what's your go-to search bait? And when do you go from a search bait, a more active presentation, to slow down to more finessey?
First 2 hours of daylight, definitely got to try a topwater. Figure out what area of the system they're at, whether they're on the inside weed line from the bank to the first set of weeds, or in the middle, or out on a deeper edge. As the summer progresses, they'll go a little deeper, for the cooler water. And, sometimes they'll be in 18 feet of water, but they will come up and crush the top water, early in the morning. Barometric changes, cloud cover. Then in the spring of the year, rattle trap, swim jigs, and spinnerbaits all can be really, really, really good. I start from the bank and then work my way out to try to figure out what the biggest concentration of fish are within a flat. So spinnerbaits, rattle traps, swim jigs, and then once the sun gets directly above, then you might have to pitch a jig or a Texas worm, in the weeds.
And I've noticed over the years too is if I'm fishing like a spinnerbait, one thing with spinnerbait, I don't just throw. Very rarely do I just throw it out, and wind it in. It's yo-yoing it, getting it to do some vertical along with the horizontal, up and down. But I'll catch a bass in an area, and I'll pick up out of the rod that's got a jig or a worm on it, and I'll catch five more bass that wouldn't bite the spinnerbait. So sometimes you'll have a pod of fish in an area you want to. If you catch one there, it's an active fish. You want to don't say, well, that ain't the only fish. You want to try going more toward a finesse type bait, which would be a plastic worm or a jig or something.
Chatterbaits have to be considered too. They're a little bit more difficult to work than a spinnerbait, but you can do so much more action with a different type of trailer. As you're reeling really slow, tapping your rod at the same time, and you're sweeping your bait. It pulsates that, skirt, and, depends upon what weight and speed. Speed and vibration are what triggers the fish a lot.
We're going to run out of time talking about smallmouth, and maybe we're going to talk about smallmouth in the next podcast, pretty much all smallmouth thing. But, let's talk a little bit about the fish handling aspect, too, because you see people trying to hold 3 or 4 or 5 bass up at one time, and ultimately 1 or 2 of them winds up on the floor of the boat flopping around. And the other thing, you can see people grab them by the lower jaw and hold the fish out horizontal. That's putting a whole lot of pressure on that fish's jaw. Maybe you break the jaw, maybe, I don't know. But what should we be looking at as far as handling fish?
Well, most of the time they have rubber-coated nets. I mean, that helps a lot, too, instead of just boat flipping them. I try to release them all at the water's edge. But, there are times at tournaments, you have to weigh the fish and you put them in a live well. Of course, we use additive to our live wells to help them out. It's like, just be as careful as you can and not drop them on the carpet of the boat, which can help destroy their coating on their body that helps prevent bacteria growth.
Well, even dry hands. I mean, Spence Petros, who's a legendary angler out there, had him on the radio show talking here a while back, and he was saying that back when they had Fishing Facts magazine down there, and he was at the showroom, they had a little small stream running through it with a bridge and a bunch of stuff, and they had a bunch of largemouth in there, and he was messing around in there one day and hooked one and broke off on it. And they went in the next day with a net, and he was trying to pick up all the fish and look for the hook to get it out of them. And he handled I think he said 2/3 of the bass in there. But a week later, all those fish were dead. And he said you could actually see his handprint. He was handling them with dry hands. You could actually see his handprint where the fungus started to grow on the fish just from being touched there with your hand and removing the slime. So I think a slime coat, the last thing you want to do is you want to get that off in there. You want to be careful of handling the fish, dry hands. If you lay them down on a measuring device, it's got to be wet. Best answer is if you're not in the middle of a money tournament or something, release them right side of the boat. Hold them up, get a quick picture, back in the water again if you're gonna.
Yeah, that's good advice. There's always kids growing up that want to catch that same fish when they become 6-pounders.
Our bass fishing up here has gotten so good. And, there was a while back, there were people that were saying, well, I'll kill every one of them bass because they're eating all the walleyes. But I think that a lot of that's been misproven that's not true, too, because especially the smallmouth. I mean, they cohabit really well with the walleyes.
So, some of the best largemouth lakes in Minnesota have like large population of walleyes, and all the tournaments I've fished, I've never once seen a walleye fry regurgitated up, into my live well. Like 90% of it's all crawfish.
You've probably seen the same thing that I've seen. If you have a lake that has a high density population of walleyes, it's always got a lower density population of largemouth and bluegills and stuff. But if you reverse that and you knock that walleye population down, then the bluegills and the bass population tends to come up.
Well, that's true with any lake that's transforming. See, lakes go through a process. When they become metamorphic lakes, it's a classification of a lake where it's, aged quite a bit more than a eutrophic. There's different fish that can adapt quite well. But there are some lakes, like Gull Lake and Whitefish Lake in Minnesota. Both of them produce fabulous populations of both. But it's big enough where there can be different sections of the lake. Like Trout Lake is really deep, clear. A lot of smallmouth in Trout Lake. And then on the main lake, out of trout, through generations, some of that fry's made it out there. And there's a rock bar out on the main lake whitefish, where a lot of big smallies. I've caught, 5-pounders off that spot. And then if you go up by the river, largemouth will be there. But the walleyes are there in the spring, and then once they get done, the largemouth in there because of the big weed flats. And then back in the day when I did a lot of underwater camera in there, I would see walleyes right here. If I go to the inside weed line, I'd see largemouth. So they cohabitat quite well. I think the biggest thing on stock walleyes through Minnesota's data is stocked walleyes seem to be more weed oriented. They don't adapt really well for like spawning on a lake.
Yeah.
It's just like, salmon, they travel thousands of miles to go to the same spot where they're spawned. Well, it's kind of hard to get back to the fishery to spawn, so they are weed oriented. And, I think northerns have more of a destructive stocking program than bass do. That's my opinion. It's just what I see out there. A lot of times when the water temp is, below 50 is when it's suggested that you can stock the walleyes. And that's when the northerns move out on the weed line. They just hammer everything.
It's unbelievable, the differences. But when we're talking bass in the North Country here, and we're talking all the way from the UP through Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the Dakotas, you're talking largemouth. There seems to be a definite line going north where you just don't, it really starts to diminish as far as the number of largemouth, doesn't there?
I fished a BASS divisional tournament up in Georgian Bay, about an hour and a half of north of Toronto, in Midland, Ontario. Boy, the smallmouth were like everywhere. Some big ones too.
Yeah, but it not a lot of largemouth.
It had great habitat for largemouth, and there wasn't one caught.
Yeah. Well, it's the same thing at Lake of the Woods. Lake of the Woods, if you did the southern edge down where you grew up down there, there's some largemouth areas in there, some largemouth, but it's not as good as it is farther south a little bit. But you move to the north end of Lake of the Woods, and I don't believe there's hardly anything for largemouth up there, is there?
Well, Billy Sandy, he's probably the good friend of mine growing up, good classmate. We used to every spring go up to Sandy's Monument Bay and clean the cabin and stuff, and we'd go out and just go fishing, and he's never mentioned, we've never caught no largemouth up there.
Yeah. In the next podcast, I think we're going to talk about smallies, and, we get people that come up here from clear down to Texas and every place else after smallmouth because, this whole northern area, whether you're going from the UP all the way to the Dakotas, we've got world-class smallmouth bass fisheries up here.
Yes, we do. Boy, there's a lake not too far from here. We'll talk about maybe the next podcast. They had like 26-pound bag for 5 fish for smallies. That's good for anywhere.
You bet. Well, Ken, this has been interesting here. We're running out of time here as we're talking for this podcast. It's been very, very interesting. I know you guys at the Hayward Bait and Bottle are really gearing up and getting ready for the season. And I know I got to get out and work on my boat because I haven't even started on that yet. I'm updating the trolling motor to that new advanced autopilot or GPS system in it. I'm adding a different locator in it. And I got to go through the wheel bearings and all that stuff. That's stuff we need to start thinking about now before we wait until, I see too many people get to the lake where they come out 200 miles to go to the lake and back in the water and the boat don't start.
Yeah, it's time to, check out Amped Outdoors batteries.
Yeah.
They have been like leading the industry, especially for you anglers that live up north. They have most lithium batteries, they got to be, charged above 32 degrees. Well, these here automatically have a heating system that heats the battery up to charge.
To charge level, yep.
Get full capacity, so you don't have to babysit them as much. Because we've been here in May and it's snowed out.
Yeah. I've got a background before I moved up here as an outboard mechanic and worked on motorcycles and everything else. So I'm pretty mechanical and electrical and everything. And, I personally, I never want to look at another lead acid battery after running the amped outdoors batteries or lithium batteries. It's just, they're so far superior to anything else there is. But anyway, we're about out of time here, Ken. I want to thank you for setting in and thank all the people out there for listening. If you like what you hear from our podcast, we're trying to build this up as big as we can and, subscribe to it. We'll be out there about every month or so. We'll put a new podcast out as long as we can here.
Yeah, I've been using a lot of different products and a lot of different wine lines, throughout the years. And, in the last couple of years, Finn's Fishing has changed my fishing game. The variety of lines and the diameter size to the presentation, can check out Finn's. And then Be More Fishing. It's one of the lightest, sensitive rod made in Florida. I try to support U.S. companies. Primarily, it's a fiberglass graphite composite with titanium line guides that it just, they're set up for technique specifics, so you can just check them out at Be More Fishing. Yeah, a lot of good products out there. We'll talk a little bit. We'll have one show here where podcast we'll probably talk more about some product stuff too. But anyway, we're about out of time for this one. Again, I want to thank all the listeners out there, and we'll be back again with another podcast here in another few weeks, and we'll be talking smallmouth bass fishing and mostly summer and in midsummer to late summer smallmouth bass fishing. Yep, and if you're into Hayward, stop by the Hayward Bait and Bottle Shop. We're doing some extensive modeling and doing some rearranging, and you'll like what you see. Any information on Hayward, go to my main website, WISC Northlandoutdoors.com or haywardlakes.com is a good website. A lot of good information. We got a lot of good lakes around here, especially if you're after some really nice smallmouth. But we've got some great largemouth bass fishing, too, here. Well, folks, that about wraps up this edition of the Northland Bassin' Podcast. Thanks for listening, and watch for our next Northland Bassin' Podcast. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please like and subscribe to the channel.